The rain fell steadily on the black umbrellas gathered around Robert Chin's graveside, each drop seeming to echo the hollow ache in Margaret's chest. She stood at the front of the small crowd, her fingers clutched around a single white rose, watching as they lowered her husband of 15 years into the ground. The cemetery's manicured lawn stretched endlessly in every direction, dotted with marble headstones that caught the gray October light. Before we see how this family drama unfolds, I'm curious. Have you ever felt unappreciated by family members you've helped? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've experienced similar ungrateful relatives, because Margaret's story might hit closer to home than you think. Margaret's black dress hung loose on her frame. She had lost 20 pounds in the 3 months since Robert's diagnosis, spending countless nights in hospital chairs and barely eating while she watched cancer steal the man she loved piece by piece. Her auburn hair, now streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in a simple bun that emphasized the sharp angles hunger had carved into her face. Behind her, she could feel their eyes. Jessica and Marcus Chen stood with their spouses, their children fidgeting in uncomfortable formal wear. Margaret had helped raise these two from the time they were 13 and 15, when their biological mother had walked out and Robert had been drowning in single parenthood. She remembered Jessica's first heartbreak, how the girl had sobbed in Margaret's arms for hours. She remembered teaching Marcus to drive, patiently enduring his teenage attitude as he learned to parallel park in their driveway. Now they watched her with the cold calculation of vultures circling wounded prey. The minister's words blurred together as Margaret's mind drifted to happier times. Robert proposing on their second anniversary, his nervous hands shaking as he presented a modest diamond ring. Their small wedding in the backyard, Jessica and Marcus walking her down the aisle since her own father had passed years earlier. Christmas mornings with the blended family she thought they had built together, opening presents around the tree that Robert and Margaret had carefully selected and wrapped together. She had never pushed to adopt Jessica and Marcus. Robert had suggested it once, but Margaret had declined, not wanting them to feel pressured or obligated. She loved them anyway, she had said. Blood didn't matter when it came to family. How naive that seemed now. The service concluded with a final prayer, and mourners began to disperse toward their cars. Margaret remained at the graveside, wanting a few more moments alone with Robert before returning to face whatever came next. She knelt carefully, mindful of her black heels sinking into the soft earth, and placed the white rose on the casket. "I love you," she whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. "I don't know how to do this without you." A throat cleared behind her. Margaret turned to see a man in an expensive charcoal suit approaching, his leather shoes pristine despite the muddy conditions. He was tall and lean with silver hair slicked back perfectly, and he carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly grocery budget. "Mrs. Chun," he said, his voice professionally smooth but lacking any warmth. "I'm David Thornfield, attorney for Jessica and Marcus Chun. I'm sorry for your loss, but I'm afraid we need to discuss some pressing legal matters." Margaret rose slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. She recognized the name. The children had mentioned hiring him to handle their father's estate, though Margaret hadn't understood why they felt the need for legal representation when Robert's will was straightforward and had been drafted by their family attorney years ago. "This hardly seems like the appropriate time or place," she said quietly. Thornfield's expression didn't change. "I understand your grief, Mrs. Chun, but my clients have concerns about the estate that need to be addressed promptly. Specifically, they've asked me to inform you that they expect you to vacate the family residence within 30 days. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She took a step backward, nearly losing her balance on the uneven ground. "Vacate? But Robert left the house to me. It's in his will." Mr. Thornfield opened his briefcase and withdrew a manila folder thick with documents. "I'm afraid the situation is more complicated than you might realize. There are questions about the validity of certain claims to the property, and my clients have reason to believe that assets were improperly transferred during Mr. Chen's illness when he may not have been of sound mind." Margaret's hands began to tremble, though whether from cold or shock she couldn't tell. Robert had been completely lucid right up until the final week. They had spent hours talking about their future, about how Margaret would manage the house and finances after he was gone. He had been worried about leaving her alone, had made her promise to stay strong and not let anyone push her around. Fat lot of good that promise was doing her now. Your clients, she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice, are his children. I helped raise them. This is their family home too. Why would they want to force me out? Thornfield's smile was cold and professional. Mrs. Chun, I think you're misunderstanding the nature of your relationship to this family. Jessica and Marcus are Mr. Chin's biological heirs. You were his second wife for a relatively brief period. They have legitimate concerns about protecting their inheritance from, shall we say, potential fortune seekers. The insult landed exactly as intended. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the October chill. Fortune seeker. As if her 15 years of marriage, of caring for Robert through 2 heart attacks and finally cancer, of loving his children as her own, could be reduced to such ugly mercenary terms. I think this conversation is over, she said, turning back toward the grave. Mrs. Chun, Thornfield called after her. You'll be receiving formal paperwork within the week. I strongly advise you to retain legal counsel. This matter will proceed with or without your cooperation. Margaret didn't turn around, but she heard his footsteps receding across the cemetery lawn. She stood alone beside Robert's grave as the groundskeepers began their work, the sound of shovels cutting through dirt marking the end of one chapter and the ominous beginning of another. In the distance, she could see Jessica and Marcus standing beside their cars, deep in conversation with Thornfield. Even from 100 yards away, their body language radiated satisfaction. They had waited barely an hour after their father's burial before delivering their ultimatum. Margaret pulled her coat tighter and began the long walk back to her car. The house where she and Robert had built their life together suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a battleground she wasn't sure she was equipped to fight for. Margaret had exactly 3 days of peace before they came for her. She spent those days moving through the house like a ghost, touching familiar objects and remembering better times. Robert's coffee mug still sat in the kitchen sink, where she had left it the morning they rushed to the hospital for the last time. His reading glasses lay folded on the nightstand beside a half-finished crossword puzzle. Everything felt suspended in time, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The doorbell rang at 8:30 on Thursday morning, sharp and insistent. Margaret wrapped her robe tighter as she made her way downstairs, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floors that she and Robert had refinished together during their second year of marriage. Through the front window, she could see a black SUV parked in the driveway alongside a white moving van that seemed impossibly large against their modest suburban street. Jessica stood on the front porch wearing designer jeans and a cream cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Margaret spent on clothing in 6 months. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, and her makeup was camera-ready despite the early hour. Behind her stood Marcus, equally polished in khakis and a button-down shirt, his dark hair styled with the kind of precision that came from expensive salon visits. Between them sat a stack of brown moving boxes. "We need to talk," Jessica said without preamble when Margaret opened the door. The morning air was crisp with the promise of winter, and Margaret could see her breath as she stepped back to let them inside. Marcus hefted 2 of the boxes and followed his sister into the living room that had once been the heart of their family gatherings. Margaret remembered Thanksgiving dinners around the dining table that was now covered with sympathy cards she hadn't yet found the strength to read. Christmas mornings when the children were still young enough to wake the whole house at dawn, racing downstairs to see what Santa had brought. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. "We brought some boxes to help you get started packing," Jessica announced, settling herself on the sofa without invitation. Her tone was brisk and businesslike, as if she were discussing a routine chore rather than dismantling 15 years of Margaret's life. "Packing," Margaret repeated slowly. She remained standing near the doorway, suddenly feeling like an intruder in her own home. Marcus set the boxes down with unnecessary force, the sound echoing through the quiet room. "Look, Margaret, we all know this is awkward. Dad's gone, and now we have to figure out how to move forward. The lawyer explained about the 30-day timeline, right? We're just trying to help you get ahead of things." Margaret's hands tightened on her robe belt. "Your father left this house to me, Marcus. We've been through this. I'm not going anywhere." Jessica laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humor. "Oh, please. Let's not pretend this was some great love story, Margaret. You trapped a lonely widower who was vulnerable after our mother left. Dad was grieving, and you took advantage of that." The accusation hit like a slap. Margaret sank into the armchair that had been Robert's favorite, the leather still holding the faint impression of his body. She had met Robert at a book club meeting 3 years after his divorce, both of them tentative about the possibility of love after loss. Their courtship had been slow and careful, built on shared interests and genuine affection rather than any kind of manipulation. "I loved your father," she said quietly. "And he loved me." Marcus snorted. "For 15 years you've been living off him while the rest of us worked for everything we have. Nice setup if you can get it. Marry a man with money and property, play house for a while, then cash out when he dies." The cruelty was breathtaking. Margaret had worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a local nonprofit throughout most of their marriage, contributing what she could while also managing the household and helping with Jessica and Marcus during their tumultuous teenage and college years. When Robert got sick, she had quit her job to care for him full-time, exhausting their savings on experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. She had never been a burden on Robert financially, though she supposed perception mattered more than reality when it came to family dynamics. Jessica leaned forward, her expression predatory. "The thing is, Margaret, you never really belonged here. You were never our real stepmother. You never adopted us. Dad never really made you part of the family legally. You were just his wife, and now that he's gone, well, that connection doesn't exist anymore." Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. Never really belonged. After helping Jessica through her eating disorder in college. After sitting up all night with Marcus when he was arrested for drunk driving at 19. After Christmas shopping and birthday celebrations and family vacations where she had tried so hard to build bridges with children who had been wounded by their mother's abandonment. "We've already talked to some realtors," Marcus continued, pulling out his phone and scrolling through messages. "The market is really good right now. We could probably get asking price, maybe more with some staging. There's this company that specializes in quick estate sales." Margaret's breath caught. "You've contacted real estate agents?" "About my house." "It's not your house," Jessica said sharply. "It's the family house. Dad's house. And now it belongs to his actual children." The actual children comment landed like a physical blow. Margaret had never been able to have children of her own, a source of quiet grief that Robert had understood and accepted without question. He had never made her feel less than complete, had never suggested that her inability to bear children made her somehow inadequate as a wife or woman. Jessica and Marcus clearly didn't share their father's compassion. "I think you both need to leave," Margaret said, rising from the chair on unsteady legs. "This conversation is inappropriate and hurtful. We just buried your father 3 days ago." Marcus stepped closer, his expression hardening. "What's inappropriate is you trying to steal our inheritance. Did you think we wouldn't notice how you isolated Dad in his final months? How you kept us away from important medical appointments and financial meetings? How convenient that he revised his will when he was sick and probably not thinking clearly." Margaret's vision blurred with sudden tears. She had never isolated Robert from anyone. The children had been busy with their own lives and careers, visiting occasionally, but leaving most of the day-to-day caregiving to Margaret. She had begged them to spend more time with their father, knowing he missed their regular presence even though he never complained about their absence. As for the will, Robert had updated it 2 years before his diagnosis, during a routine estate planning review with their longtime attorney. The changes had been minimal, reflecting their marriage and ensuring Margaret would be provided for if something happened to him. There had been nothing sinister or manipulative about the process. The boxes sat on the coffee table like an ultimatum, brown cardboard symbols of everything Margaret stood to lose. But as she looked at Jessica and Marcus, she saw something else in their faces beyond greed and entitlement. She saw fear, the kind that came from people who weren't quite as confident in their position as they wanted to appear. And for the first time since Robert's funeral, Margaret felt a small spark of something that might eventually grow into fight. "Fine," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "If that's how you want to handle this, then we'll let the courts decide. I'm calling my attorney today." Jessica and Marcus exchanged a glance, and Margaret caught something that looked almost like satisfaction pass between them. "Good," Jessica said, standing and smoothing her cashmere sweater. "We'll see you in court then. And Margaret, you might want to start packing anyway, just in case things don't go the way you're hoping." The Montgomery County Probate Court building was an imposing structure of gray stone and tall windows that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who entered seeking justice. Margaret climbed the courthouse steps on legs that felt unsteady, clutching a worn leather purse that contained every important document she could find related to Robert's will and their marriage. The November morning was bitter cold, and her breath came in visible puffs as she paused at the entrance to gather her courage. Inside, the hallways buzzed with the quiet efficiency of legal proceedings. Attorneys in expensive suits hurried past carrying briefcases and stacks of files, their heels clicking against polished marble floors. Margaret felt desperately out of place in her simple black dress and coat, both purchased years ago for occasions she had hoped would never come. Her attorney, Patricia Vance, waited near the courtroom entrance. Patricia was a kind woman in her 60s who had handled Robert's original estate planning and had agreed to represent Margaret despite the modest retainer fee Margaret could afford. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore a navy blazer that had seen better days. Next to David Thornfield's obvious prosperity, Patricia looked like exactly what she was, a small-town lawyer who specialized in wills and simple real estate transactions, not complex estate litigation. They're well prepared, Patricia whispered as they entered the courtroom. Thornfield has been practicing estate law for 30 years, and he doesn't take cases he thinks he might lose. But the will is clear, Margaret. Robert left you the house and primary assets. We just need to stick to the facts. Margaret nodded, though her confidence wavered as she saw the opposition's setup. Thornfield had claimed an entire table near the front of the courtroom, documents organized in neat stacks and labeled file folders. Jessica and Marcus sat behind him, both dressed impeccably for their roles as grieving children fighting to protect their father's legacy. Jessica had chosen a conservative black suit that made her look professional and sympathetic, while Marcus wore a charcoal gray ensemble that emphasized his height and serious demeanor. Between them sat an older woman Margaret didn't recognize, well-dressed and taking notes on an expensive tablet. Probably a paralegal or legal assistant, another sign of the resources arrayed against Margaret's modest defense. The Honorable Judge Patricia Williams entered promptly at 10 o'clock, and the bailiff called the courtroom to order. Judge Williams was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She had a reputation for being fair but no nonsense, the kind of judge who appreciated preparation and despised wasted time. This is a probate matter regarding the estate of Robert James Chun, deceased, she announced, settling behind the bench and opening the case file. The petitioners seek to contest certain provisions of the decedent's will, specifically those relating to the disposition of real property. Mr. Thornfield, you may begin. Thornfield rose with the kind of confidence that came from decades of courtroom victories. Thank you, Your Honor. We appear today on behalf of Jessica Chun Morrison and Marcus Chun, the biological children of the deceased Robert Chun. We seek to protect their rightful inheritance from what we believe to be undue influence exerted upon their father during his final illness. Margaret felt Patricia tense beside her. Undue influence was a serious legal claim, suggesting that Margaret had somehow manipulated Robert into changing his will through coercion or deception. If successful, it could invalidate not just the house bequest, but potentially Robert's entire estate plan. Your Honor, Thornfield continued, his voice carrying easily through the courtroom. Robert Chun was a devoted father who worked his entire life to provide for his children. He purchased the family home in 1998, shortly after his divorce from his first wife, and it served as the primary residence where he raised Jessica and Marcus to adulthood. This property represents not just financial value, but irreplaceable sentimental significance as the place where these children grew up and formed their most precious memories of their father. Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. She had helped create many of those precious memories, driving the children to school events and helping with homework around the same kitchen table Thornfield was now describing as exclusively theirs. However, Thornfield's tone grew darker. In 2008, Mr. Chun married Margaret Walsh, a woman he had known for only 18 months. This was a marriage of convenience for Mrs. Walsh, a woman who had never been able to establish herself financially and saw an opportunity to secure her future through an advantageous union with a successful businessman. The characterization stung because it contained just enough truth to sound plausible while completely ignoring the genuine affection Margaret and Robert had shared. Yes, Margaret had been struggling financially when they met, working part-time and living in a small apartment. But Robert had pursued her, not the other way around, charmed by her intelligence and kindness rather than any calculated seduction on her part. In the months preceding his death, Thornfield continued, Mr. Chun was battling cancer and undergoing aggressive treatments that affected his cognitive function. Medical records will show that he was frequently disoriented and dependent on medication that could impair judgment. It was during this vulnerable period that Mrs. Walsh convinced him to revise his estate plan, effectively disinheriting his own children in favor of a woman who had contributed nothing meaningful to the family legacy. Margaret's breath caught. Nothing meaningful. 15 years of marriage, of caring for Robert through 2 heart attacks and finally cancer, of loving his children as her own, dismissed as meaningless by a man who had never bothered to learn her story. Judge Williams looked up from her notes. Mr. Thornfield, do you have evidence that the decedent lacked capacity at the time the will was executed, or are you merely alleging undue influence? Your Honor, we have testimony from family members about Mr. Chin's declining mental state, as well as medical records documenting his treatment regimen. But perhaps more significantly, we can demonstrate that Mrs. Walsh systematically isolated Mr. Chin from his children during his final months, limiting their access and preventing them from understanding the full extent of his medical condition. Margaret's attorney Patricia finally stood. Objection, Your Honor. That's not evidence. It's speculation and character assassination. Mrs. Chun never prevented the children from visiting their father. If they chose not to visit frequently, that was their own decision. Judge Williams raised her hand. I'll hear the testimony and evaluate its credibility myself. Mr. Thornfield, please call your first witness. Jessica walked to the witness stand with composure that spoke to hours of preparation. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, then settled into the witness chair with practiced grace. Under Thornfield's gentle questioning, she painted a picture of a devoted daughter who had watched helplessly as Margaret gradually took control of her father's life. My father was never the same after he married her, Jessica testified, her voice carrying just the right note of grief and frustration. Before Margaret, he was social and engaged. He had friends, hobbies, interests beyond work. But she gradually isolated him from everyone who cared about him. She convinced him that his old friends didn't really understand him, that his children were too busy with their own lives to care about his happiness. Margaret wanted to scream that Robert had withdrawn naturally as his health declined, that she had begged Jessica and Marcus to visit more often, that she had organized family dinners that the children consistently found excuses to skip. But she sat silently, watching Jessica perform for the judge with the skill of someone who had always been comfortable manipulating adults. In the final months, Jessica continued, when Dad was really sick, Margaret wouldn't let us see him alone. She was always there, monitoring our conversations, cutting visits short if Dad seemed tired. When we asked about his treatment options or tried to discuss his care, she told us it was none of our business, that she was his wife and medical decisions were hers to make. This was partially true but completely misrepresented. Margaret had been protective of Robert's limited energy, yes, but only because the children's visits often left him emotionally drained. Jessica had a tendency to bring up stressful topics like business decisions and estate planning when Robert was struggling just to get through each day of treatment. Marcus often arrived with his own problems and financial concerns, seeking advice from a man who barely had the strength to feed himself. Margaret had tried to shield Robert from unnecessary stress, not isolate him from his children. Your witness, Thornfield said to Patricia with a smile that suggested he was confident Jessica had delivered exactly the testimony he needed. Patricia's cross-examination was gentle but persistent. She established that Jessica lived 4 hours away and had visited only 6 times during Robert's 8-month illness. She pointed out that Jessica had been invited to every medical appointment but had attended only 2. She got Jessica to admit that Margaret had called her with regular updates about Robert's condition, updates that Jessica often seemed too busy to receive. But the damage was done. Jessica's testimony had painted Margaret as a controlling woman who had isolated a sick man from his loving children for her own selfish purposes. Marcus followed with similar testimony, describing a stepmother who had never really tried to bond with them and had become increasingly possessive of their father over the years. He spoke movingly about family heirlooms that Margaret now possessed, items that belonged to the Chun family legacy and should be passed down to Robert's biological children. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly, "my grandmother's wedding ring set is sitting in Margaret's jewelry box right now. Those rings have been in our family for 3 generations. My father gave them to Margaret, but only because she convinced him that she deserved them more than Jessica, his own daughter who should inherit them someday." Margaret's face burned with humiliation. The ring set was beautiful, antique platinum with small diamonds that caught the light like stars. Robert had presented it to her on their 5th anniversary, explaining that his mother had wanted her jewelry to go to the woman who made her son happiest. Jessica had been dating different men every few months at the time, nowhere near marriage, while Margaret and Robert were building a stable, loving partnership. But sitting in that courtroom, Marcus made it sound like Margaret had manipulated a dying man into giving away precious family heirlooms that rightfully belonged to his blood relatives. When Patricia rose for cross-examination, she tried to establish that Robert had been mentally sharp throughout most of his illness, that the will revision had actually occurred years before his diagnosis, that Margaret had been a devoted caregiver who had sacrificed her own health and financial security to care for her husband. But her questions lacked the polish and aggressive confidence of Thornfield's presentation. More damaging, Patricia seemed genuinely overwhelmed by the complexity of the case and the resources arrayed against her client. She fumbled with document references and failed to object to several leading questions that should have been challenged. Margaret began to suspect that Patricia had never handled a case quite like this, had never faced an opponent with Thornfield's experience and reputation. As the morning wore on, Judge Williams seemed increasingly sympathetic to the children's position. She asked sharp questions about why Robert would choose to leave his family home to his second wife rather than his biological children. She questioned whether Margaret truly understood the sentimental value of the property to Jessica and Marcus, who had grown up there and formed their childhood memories within those walls. By lunch recess, Margaret felt like she was drowning. The court reporter's fingers flew over her machine, recording every damaging word that would become part of the permanent record. The gallery behind them held a few curious observers, probably other attorneys waiting for their cases to be called, all watching Margaret's humiliation play out like afternoon entertainment. Outside the courtroom during the break, Patricia tried to sound optimistic. "The will is still valid," she insisted. "They haven't proven undue influence or incapacity. Judge Williams is just being thorough, asking the hard questions she needs to ask." But Margaret could see the worry in Patricia's eyes, could hear the doubt creeping into her voice. The afternoon session would determine whether Margaret lost everything or somehow found the strength to fight for the life she and Robert had built together. Either way, she knew she was facing the battle of her life against opponents who had every advantage except the truth. After lunch, Margaret returned to the courtroom feeling like she was walking to her own execution. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows seemed harsher somehow, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Jessica and Marcus looked confident as they took their seats, whispering quietly with Thornfield, who appeared pleased with their morning performance. Patricia Vance, however, seemed different. During the lunch break, she had made several phone calls from the courthouse lobby, her voice urgent and animated in a way Margaret hadn't seen before. Now she sat straighter at their table, organizing documents with newfound purpose. A cardboard file box that hadn't been there that morning sat at her feet. "Your Honor," Patricia said as Judge Williams called the court back to session, "I'd like to call Margaret Chin to the stand to respond to the allegations made this morning." Margaret's heart hammered as she walked to the witness box. The oath-taking felt surreal, her own voice sounding distant as she promised to tell the truth. From the stand, she could see Jessica and Marcus clearly, their expressions expectant and slightly smug, as if they were waiting for her to complete her own destruction. Patricia approached with a manila folder in her hands. "Mrs. Chun, you've heard testimony this morning suggesting that you contributed nothing meaningful to the Chun family during your 15-year marriage. I'd like to explore that claim. Can you tell the court about your relationship with Jessica and Marcus during their college years?" Margaret's voice was steady despite her nerves. I helped raise them from the time they were teenagers. When I married Robert, Jessica was starting her senior year of high school and Marcus was a sophomore. They were good kids, but they had been through a lot with their parents' divorce. Robert was working long hours trying to keep his business afloat, and I tried to provide stability and support. What kind of support? Patricia asked. Emotional support primarily. Help with homework, driving them to activities, being there when they needed to talk. But also financial support when necessary. Robert's business had some difficult years in the early 2010s, and college expenses were a significant burden. Thornfield stood up quickly. Objection, Your Honor. This is vague and self-serving testimony without supporting documentation. Judge Williams looked at Patricia. Counselor, do you have documentation to support these claims? Patricia smiled, and for the first time all day, Margaret saw genuine confidence in her attorney's demeanor. Yes, Your Honor, I do. With the court's permission, I'd like to introduce several exhibits into evidence. Patricia returned to their table and retrieved the file box, lifting out a thick folder marked with Jessica's name. From this folder, she withdrew a stack of documents and approached the bench. Your Honor, these are bank records and canceled checks showing tuition payments for Jessica Chin Morrison's undergraduate education at Northwestern University from 2009 to 2013. The payments total approximately $195,000 over 4 years. Margaret watched Jessica's face drain of color as Patricia continued. The payments were made from an account held solely in Margaret Chin's name, funded by her inheritance from her late father's estate. These are not joint accounts with Robert Chin. These payments came directly from Margaret's personal funds. Thornfield was on his feet immediately. Objection. These documents weren't disclosed during discovery. We've had no opportunity to examine their authenticity. Your Honor, Patricia replied calmly. These documents were requested from the bank this morning after hearing testimony suggesting my client contributed nothing to the family. The bank records speak for themselves and are properly authenticated with the institution's seal. Judge Williams examined the documents carefully. Mr. Thornfield, you opened this door by claiming Mrs. Chun contributed nothing meaningful to the family. I'm going to allow these exhibits, but you'll have the opportunity to examine them and cross-examine the witness about their contents. Patricia turned back to Margaret, who was watching Jessica whisper frantically to Marcus. Mrs. Chun, can you explain why you paid for Jessica's college education from your personal funds rather than asking your husband to cover these expenses? Margaret's voice grew stronger as she spoke. Robert's business was struggling during those years. The 2008 recession hit his construction company very hard, and he was having trouble getting contracts. We didn't want Jessica to suffer because of financial difficulties, so I used money my father had left me to ensure she could attend the university of her choice without taking on student loan debt. The Northwestern education that Jessica had leveraged into a successful marketing career, Margaret thought, but didn't say. The degree that had opened doors and provided opportunities that Jessica now took completely for granted. Patricia reached for another folder, this one marked with Marcus's name. And what about Marcus's education, Mrs. Chun? Marcus attended DePaul University for his undergraduate degree from 2011 to 2015, then went on to Northwestern Law School from 2015 to 2018. Again, I paid his tuition and living expenses from my inheritance to prevent him from graduating with student loan debt. More documents emerged from the folder, bank records showing a steady stream of payments over 7 years. Patricia read the totals aloud for the court record. Undergraduate tuition of $168,000, law school tuition of $212,000, plus living expenses that brought Marcus's total education costs to approximately $420,000. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Margaret could see Marcus staring at the documents in Patricia's hands as if they were evidence of some impossible crime. His mouth hung slightly open, and his careful courtroom composure had completely evaporated. Mrs. Chun, Patricia continued, these payments span nearly a decade. That's a substantial financial commitment to children who weren't legally yours. Why did you make this sacrifice? Margaret looked directly at Jessica and Marcus as she answered. Because I love them. Because I wanted them to have every opportunity in life. Because Robert was their father and my husband, and I believed we were building a family together. I never expected gratitude, but I certainly never expected to be called a gold digger by children whose education I funded with my own inheritance. Thornfield's objections came rapid fire now, but Judge Williams overruled them all. The documents were authentic, properly sourced, and directly relevant to the claims about Margaret's contributions to the family. Patricia returned to her table and retrieved yet another folder. Your Honor, I have additional exhibits showing payments Mrs. Chun made for other family expenses during this same period. Car payments for Jessica's first vehicle after college, down payment assistance for Marcus's first apartment in Chicago, even payments for Jessica's wedding expenses in 2017. Each revelation hit like a physical blow to the stepchildren's case. Jessica's dream wedding at the Four Seasons, the elaborate reception with 200 guests, the designer dress that had cost more than most people's cars, all funded by the woman she had spent the morning calling a manipulative gold digger. Margaret watched Thornfield scramble through his own papers, clearly searching for some way to explain or minimize this devastating evidence. His confident demeanor had vanished, replaced by the frantic energy of an attorney watching his case collapse in real time. Mrs. Chun, Patricia said, returning to stand before the witness box, you've heard testimony this morning suggesting that you isolated Mr. Chun from his children and manipulated him during his illness. In light of these financial records showing nearly $800,000 in support you provided to Jessica and Marcus over the years, how do you respond to those allegations? Margaret felt a strength she hadn't known she possessed flowing through her voice. I find those allegations particularly painful given my financial support of Jessica and Marcus throughout their adult lives. I never mentioned these payments to the court because I didn't think it was necessary to justify my place in this family. I supported them because I loved them and wanted them to succeed. I certainly never expected that generosity to be thrown back in my face by people calling me a fortune hunter. The irony was so complete, it was almost beautiful. Jessica and Marcus, who had spent the morning painting Margaret as a woman who had contributed nothing meaningful to the family, had built their entire adult lives on her financial foundation. Jessica's college degree, her career success, her elaborate wedding, Marcus's legal education, his law practice, even their current ability to hire Thornfield to represent them in this case. All of it funded by the woman they were now trying to destroy. Patricia approached the witness stand with one final document. Mrs. Chun, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit J. Can you identify this document? Margaret looked at the paper and felt her throat tighten with emotion. This is a letter Robert wrote to me on our 10th wedding anniversary. He kept a copy in his desk drawer. Would you read the relevant portion to the court? Margaret's voice wavered slightly as she read her late husband's words aloud. My dearest Margaret, I know I don't tell you often enough how grateful I am for everything you've done for our family. Watching you love Jessica and Marcus as your own children, supporting their dreams even when it meant sacrificing your own comfort, has been one of the greatest privileges of my life. You gave them opportunities one couldn't afford to provide, and you did it without ever asking for recognition or gratitude. You are the heart of this family, and I can't imagine what any of us would do without you. The letter continued with more personal sentiments, but Patricia stopped there. The point had been made with devastating clarity. Robert himself had acknowledged and appreciated Margaret's financial contributions to his children's lives. Your witness, Patricia said to Thornfield, her tone carrying a note of challenge. But Thornfield looked like a man who had just watched his entire case explode. He stood slowly, shuffled through his papers one more time, then looked up at Judge Williams. No questions for this witness, Your Honor. The admission of defeat was so complete that Margaret almost felt sorry for Jessica and Marcus, sitting behind their attorney's table in stunned silence as the full scope of their miscalculation became clear. They had built their entire case on the premise that Margaret was a greedy opportunist who had contributed nothing to the family, and that foundation had just crumbled beneath them like sand. As Margaret stepped down from the witness stand and returned to her seat, she caught Jessica's eye. For just a moment, she saw something that might have been shame flicker across the younger woman's face before the mask of righteous indignation slammed back into place. But the damage was done. The truth was now part of the court record, documented and undeniable. The children who had called her a gold digger had been living off her gold for most of their adult lives, and everyone in that courtroom now knew it. Patricia Vance was far from finished. As Margaret returned to the plaintiff's table, Her attorney was already organizing another set of documents with the methodical precision of someone who had spent the lunch break making very productive phone calls. "Your Honor," Patricia announced, "I have additional exhibits that I believe will provide the court with a complete picture of Mrs. Chin's financial contributions to this family over the past 15 years. Thornfield tried one more objection. "Your Honor, this is turning into a fishing expedition. The plaintiff is simply trying to overwhelm the court with irrelevant financial details." Judge Williams looked at him with barely concealed impatience. "Mr. Thornfield, your client spent the morning arguing that Mrs. Chun contributed nothing meaningful to this family and married Mr. Chin purely for financial gain. These documents directly contradict that central claim. I'm going to allow the evidence." Patricia approached the bench with another thick folder. "Your Honor, these are mortgage documents from First National Bank showing down payment assistance provided by Margaret Chin for both Jessica and Marcus's first home purchases." She handed copies to the court clerk and to Thornfield, whose face grew progressively paler as he scanned the pages. The documents showed a $30,000 payment from Margaret's account toward Jessica's townhouse in Evanston in 2016, and a $45,000 down payment assistance for Marcus's condominium in downtown Chicago in 2017. "Mrs. Chun," Patricia continued, addressing Margaret directly, "can you explain why you provided down payment assistance for homes that Jessica and Marcus purchased after they had established their own careers?" Margaret looked toward Jessica and Marcus, both of whom seemed to have shrunk in their seats. Neither could meet her eyes as she answered. Both children wanted to purchase homes in expensive areas where their careers were flourishing, but they were concerned about saving enough for adequate down payments while also managing their student loan debt. "Since I had paid their education expenses, they didn't have the student loan burden many young professionals face, but they still needed help with home purchases in competitive markets." The irony was almost painful. Margaret had paid their education expenses to prevent student loan debt, then helped them buy homes precisely because they were debt-free and could qualify for better mortgage terms. Her generosity had created opportunities that they now took completely for granted. Patricia pulled out another set of documents. "Your Honor, these records show additional payments made by Mrs. Chun, including $48,000 for Jessica's wedding at the Four Seasons Hotel in 2017. Margaret remembered that wedding clearly. Jessica had dreamed of an elaborate celebration, but Robert's business was still recovering from the recession and cash flow was tight. Margaret had quietly arranged to cover the wedding expenses, working with the vendors directly to ensure Jessica's special day would be everything she wanted. The bride, who had spent the morning calling her a manipulative gold digger, had danced at a reception Margaret funded. But Patricia wasn't finished. "Your Honor, perhaps most significantly, these bank records show a $150,000 investment Mrs. Chun made in 2018 in a technology startup company founded by Marcus Chin." The courtroom fell completely silent. Margaret watched Marcus's face cycle through shock, recognition, and something that might have been horror as he realized where this revelation was heading. "Mrs. Chun," Patricia said, "can you describe the circumstances of this investment?" Margaret's voice remained steady despite the emotional weight of the memory. "Marcus came to Robert and me with a business plan for a mobile app he wanted to develop with some classmates from Northwestern. They needed capital for development and marketing, and traditional venture capital wasn't interested in such an early-stage company. Marcus was passionate about the project and convinced it would be successful. What happened to that investment, Mrs. Chun?" "The company failed within 18 months. Marcus and his partners burned through the initial capital without generating significant revenue. I lost the entire investment, but I never asked Marcus to repay it because I knew he had given his best effort, and I didn't want financial pressure to damage our relationship." The admission hung in the air like an indictment. Marcus had not only accepted Margaret's money for his failed venture, he had never even acknowledged the loss or offered to make partial repayment over time. He had simply moved on to his current law practice, built on the foundation of the legal education Margaret had funded, while she absorbed the $150,000 loss without complaint. Patricia returned to her table and pulled out a calculator. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to provide a summary of the total financial support Mrs. Chun provided to Jessica and Marcus Chun over the 15 years of her marriage to their father." She read from her notes as she calculated the running total. Jessica's undergraduate education at Northwestern University, $195,000. Marcus's undergraduate education at DePaul University, $168,000. Marcus's law school education at Northwestern, $212,000. Down payment assistance for Jessica's home, $30,000. Down payment assistance for Marcus's home, $45,000. Jessica's wedding expenses, $48,000. Investment in Marcus's failed startup, $150,000. Patricia looked up from her calculator. The total financial support Mrs. Chun provided to Jessica and Marcus Chun from her personal inheritance and savings amounts to $848,000. The number landed in the courtroom like a physical blow. Margaret heard someone in the gallery gasp softly. Even Judge Williams looked startled by the magnitude of Margaret's generosity toward children who had spent the morning calling her a fortune hunter. $848,000. Nearly $1 million of Margaret's own money, invested in the futures of stepchildren who now claimed she had contributed nothing meaningful to their family. Patricia approached Thornfield's table and handed him copies of every document she had referenced. Mr. Thornfield, I'm providing you with complete copies of all exhibits for your review. Perhaps you'd like a moment to confer with your clients about whether they wish to continue with their current strategy. Thornfield's confidence had completely evaporated. He huddled with Jessica and Marcus, their whispered conversation growing increasingly agitated. Margaret could see Jessica dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, though whether from genuine emotion or calculated performance was impossible to determine. Your Honor, Patricia continued, I have one final exhibit I'd like to submit. This is a handwritten note from Robert Chun to his financial advisor, dated 6 months before his death, specifically acknowledging and documenting Margaret's financial contributions to his children's welfare. In it, he expresses gratitude for her generosity and states his intention to ensure she is properly provided for in his will as recognition of her sacrifices for the family. The note was brief but devastating to Jessica and Marcus's case. In Robert's own handwriting, he acknowledged that Margaret had given significantly more to his children than he had ever been able to provide, and that he considered his estate planning an opportunity to balance the scales of generosity within their family. Margaret felt tears threatening as Patricia read Robert's words aloud. My beloved Margaret has given Jessica and Marcus opportunities one could never have afforded. Her inheritance from her father has funded their educations, their homes, their dreams. She asks for nothing in return and never mentions these gifts. I want to ensure that when I'm gone, she is cared for with the same generosity she has shown my children. The contrast with the morning's testimony could not have been more stark. Jessica and Marcus had painted Margaret as a scheming manipulator, but their own father's words revealed her as a selflessly generous woman who had quietly funded their adult lives while asking for nothing in return. Judge Williams looked at the financial documents spread across her bench, then at Jessica and Marcus, who both appeared to be in shock. The children who had claimed Margaret married their father for his money had actually received nearly $1 million of her money over the years. The children who had demanded she return family heirlooms were wearing jewelry and living in homes she had helped them afford. The children who had accused her of contributing nothing meaningful to their family had built their entire adult lives on her financial foundation. Mr. Thornfield, Judge Williams said, her tone significantly cooler than it had been that morning. Do your clients wish to present any additional testimony in light of these exhibits? Thornfield consulted his notes one more time, then stood slowly. Your Honor, we would like to request a brief recess to review these documents and confer with our clients about how to proceed. But Margaret could see in his posture that the fight had gone out of him completely. There was no recovering from revelations this damaging to his client's credibility. Jessica and Marcus had not only lied about Margaret's contributions to their family, they had built their entire case on a foundation of ingratitude so profound it was almost breathtaking. The recess was granted, but Margaret knew the outcome was no longer in doubt. The truth had finally emerged, documented and undeniable, and it painted a very different picture than the one Jessica and Marcus had tried to present. As the courtroom emptied for the 15-minute break, Margaret sat quietly at her table, feeling strangely calm for the first time in weeks. The worst was over. The truth was out. And sometimes, she reflected, the truth really was enough. When court reconvened, Thornfield looked like a man who had aged 10 years and 15 minutes. Jessica and Marcus sat behind him with the deflated posture of people who had finally grasped the magnitude of their miscalculation. "Your Honor," Thornfield said, rising slowly, "after reviewing the exhibits and consulting with my clients, we would like to withdraw our petition to contest the will." Judge Williams set down her pen and fixed Jessica and Marcus with a stare that could have frozen water. "Before I accept that withdrawal, I want to address something that troubles me deeply about this case." Her voice carried the weight of judicial authority as she continued. "I have been on this bench for 12 years, and I have rarely seen such a profound disconnect between allegations and reality. Jessica and Marcus Chun came into my courtroom this morning claiming their stepmother was a gold-digging manipulator who contributed nothing to their family. The evidence shows she contributed nearly $900,000 to their educations, homes, and futures." Margaret watched Jessica dab at her eyes while Marcus stared at his hands, both children finally understanding the price of their greed and ingratitude. "Mrs. Chun," Judge Williams said, turning to Margaret, "you have shown extraordinary generosity to children who clearly didn't deserve it. This court finds no evidence of undue influence, incapacity, or any other grounds for invalidating your late husband's will. The estate will be distributed exactly as Robert Chin intended." The judge's gaze returned to Jessica and Marcus. "As for you two, I hope you've learned something about the difference between legal inheritance and moral obligation. Your stepmother had no legal duty to fund your adult lives, yet she chose to invest in your futures when your own father couldn't afford to do so. Your response was to try to steal her home through false allegations. Frankly, your behavior is shameful." Jessica finally looked up, tears streaming down her face. "Your Honor, we were grieving and confused. We didn't remember all the financial help Margaret had provided over the years." Margaret's quiet dignity and victory, offering them continued relationship if they can show respect, showed her true character. Judge Williams wasn't buying the excuse. "Grief doesn't justify greed, young lady. And $800,000 isn't something you simply forget." The judge signed the final order with decisive strokes. "Mrs. Chun retains full ownership of the marital home and all assets bequeathed to her." Case dismissed. Outside the courthouse, Margaret paused on the steps where this nightmare had begun weeks ago. Jessica and Marcus approached hesitantly, their earlier arrogance replaced by something that might have been genuine remorse. "Margaret," Jessica whispered, "we're so sorry. We didn't think about everything you'd done for us. We were just scared about losing Dad's house and the memories there." Margaret looked at them both, seeing not the entitled adults who had tried to destroy her, but the broken teenagers she had once helped heal. "I know you were scared. Grief makes us do things we normally wouldn't do. But if you want any relationship with me going forward, it has to be built on honesty and respect." Marcus nodded, his voice barely audible. "We understand. And Margaret, thank you for everything. We should have said that years ago." Margaret's quiet strength really paid off in the end. "What do you think? Should she have cut them off completely, or was offering them a second chance the right move? Share your thoughts below about how you'd handle ungrateful stepchildren." That evening, Margaret sat in her living room, surrounded by the familiar comfort of home. Robert's favorite chair still held his impression, and his coffee mug sat clean in the kitchen cabinet, waiting. The house felt peaceful for the first time since his death, no longer a battlefield, but simply the place where she and Robert had built their life together. She was finally home.